The briefing room at Naval Air Station Oceana fell silent the moment the Marine Corps captain slammed his hand on the table. His face had gone from confident tan to furious red in the span of 3 seconds. The woman sitting across from him didn't flinch. She simply adjusted the worn leather jacket draped over her chair and met his glare with eyes the color of winter steel. Her name tag read Vance in faded letters, and beneath it, barely visible in the dim fluorescent light, was a patch most people overlooked, a trident piercing through wings, encircled by a phrase in Latin that translated to "From the shadows we strike." The captain didn't notice. He was too busy being offended. "Do you know who I am?" he demanded, his voice carrying across the room where a dozen other officers pretended to review mission briefs. "I'm Captain Marcus DeWitt, 3rd Marine Aircraft Wing, 2 Tour in Helmand Province. I've logged over 3,000 flight hours in combat zones, and you're telling me I can't access the mission parameters for Operation Tidebreak?" Lieutenant Commander Kay Vance tilted her head slightly, the motion so subtle it could have been mistaken for a shadow crossing her face. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and she wore a standard Navy flight suit with no remarkable decorations visible. To DeWitt, she looked like just another desk officer, probably some intelligence liaison too junior to understand how things worked in the real world. He had no idea that 3 floors below them, in a secured operations center that required retinal scans and voice authentication to access, 16 Navy SEALs were checking their equipment and waiting for her signal to launch. He didn't know that the mission he was demanding access to had been planned over 18 months, involved assets from 3 different commands, and that every detail had been approved by people whose names would never appear in any public record. "Captain DeWitt," Vance said quietly, her voice carrying none of his volume but somehow filling the room anyway, "I understand your frustration. However, Operation Tidebreak is compartmentalized under Special Access Program protocols. Your clearance, while impressive, doesn't extend to this particular operation." DeWitt's jaw tightened. "I'm the senior air combat officer for this region. Every operation that uses airspace in my sector requires my approval." Vance folded her hands on the table. "Not this one." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Someone coughed, a pen clicked, and Captain DeWitt made the mistake that would define the next 48 hours of his career. "Listen, sweetheart," he said, leaning forward with a condescending smile. "Why don't you go find someone who actually understands military operations and let the adults handle this?" The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Vance's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes, something that might have warned DeWitt if he'd been paying attention. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a phone, the kind with multiple security features and an encryption system that cost more than DeWitt's car. She placed it on the table between them, face down, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that made several officers look up from their fake paperwork. "Captain, I'm going to make a call. After I'm done, you're going to receive new orders. I strongly suggest you follow them without question." She paused, letting the words settle. "Because the next person who walks through that door isn't going to be as patient as I am." DeWitt laughed, actually laughed. "Is that a threat? From a lieutenant commander? Do you have any idea how fast I can have you written up for insubordination?" Vance picked up the phone and dialed a number from memory. It rang once. "This is Valkyrie. We have a situation at Oceana, requesting immediate clarification of authority for Operation Tidebreak." She listened for a moment, her eyes never leaving DeWitt's face. "Confirmed. ETA 10 minutes." She ended the call and set the phone down again. "Captain, in approximately 10 minutes, Rear Admiral Catherine Reeves will arrive to personally explain the chain of command for this operation. Until then, I suggest you remain seated and quiet." DeWitt's smile faltered. Admiral Reeves was the commander of Naval Special Warfare Command, a woman whose reputation preceded her like thunder before a storm. She didn't leave her office for trivial matters. She certainly didn't make personal appearances at routine briefings. Unless, of course, the briefing wasn't routine at all. The room had gone completely silent now. Every officer present understood they were witnessing something significant, though most of them couldn't quite grasp what. Vance returned to her tablet, scrolling through mission parameters with the calm efficiency of someone reading a grocery list. DeWitt sat frozen, his confidence beginning to crack like ice on a warming lake. 8 minutes later, the door opened. Admiral Reeves entered, followed by two armed security personnel and a Navy captain wearing the insignia of a SEAL team commander. The Admiral was in her 50s, with silver hair cut short and eyes that had seen things most people couldn't imagine. She surveyed the room, her gaze landing on DeWitt with the precision of a laser-guided missile. "Captain DeWitt," she said, her voice crisp and cold, "step outside, now." DeWitt stood, his face pale. As he passed Vance's chair, the Admiral spoke again. "Lieutenant Commander Vance will continue her mission brief. No one in this room is to disturb her or question her authority again. Is that understood?" A chorus of "Yes, ma'am" followed her out the door. The SEAL commander remained behind. He was a tall man with weathered features and the quiet intensity of someone who'd spent years operating in the darkest corners of the world. He walked to Vance's table and sat down in the chair DeWitt had vacated. When he spoke, his voice carried respect that bordered on reverence. "Valkyrie, the team is ready for your brief. We're wheels up in 90 minutes. Vance nodded and stood, gathering her materials. As she walked toward the Secure Operations Center, several officers watched her with new eyes. The patch on her jacket, previously overlooked, now drew attention. The trident and wings weren't decorative. They were a statement. She wasn't just another desk officer. She was the woman who planned the operations that desk officers would never read about. She was the ghost in the machine, the mind behind missions that redrew maps and changed governments without a single news camera present. 3 floors below, in a room that smelled of gun oil and determination, 16 Navy SEALs stood as she entered. Their commander called them to attention. Vance waved them down. "Gentlemen, let's make this quick. You've all reviewed the target package. The compound is located in the Khyber region, approximately 40 kilometers from the Afghan border. Intelligence indicates high-value target Alpha will be present for approximately 6 hours, beginning at 0300 local time tomorrow. Our window is tight." She pulled up a satellite image on the main display. The compound appeared as a cluster of buildings surrounded by high walls, guard towers at each corner, and only 2 access points. "Your insertion will be via high-altitude jump at 25,000 feet. The terrain is mountainous, winds are variable, and you'll be operating in complete darkness. Once on the ground, you'll have 22 minutes to reach the compound before the security shift change." A SEAL near the back raised his hand. "Valkyrie, what's our air support package?" Vance switched to another screen showing aircraft positions. 2 FA-18 Super Hornets will maintain station at 30,000 feet, 12 miles south. They're loaded for close air support, but are not to engage unless you're compromised. We cannot risk alerting the target before you're in position. Additionally, an AC-130 gunship will orbit at 15,000 feet, outside the compound's air defense range. If things go sideways, you'll have 60 seconds of covering fire to reach your extraction point. Another SEAL spoke up, younger but with eyes that had already seen combat. "And extraction. 2 MH-60 helicopters will insert at the primary LZ, 1 mile north of the compound. If the primary is compromised, you'll move to the secondary LZ, 3 miles northeast. Flight time to the carrier is 40 minutes. The USS Abraham Lincoln will be positioned in the Arabian Sea for immediate medical support if needed." The room absorbed the information with professional silence. These men had conducted hundreds of operations, but the level of detail in Vance's briefing indicated something beyond routine. This wasn't just another target. This was the target, the one they'd been hunting for months. The SEAL commander leaned forward. "Valkyrie, give it to us straight. What's the risk assessment?" Vance met his gaze without hesitation. 70% chance of successful extraction with zero casualties. 20% chance of contact requiring emergency extraction. 10% chance of significant complications. She paused. But if we get Alpha, we cut off funding for 3 major terror networks and dismantle an organization that's been operating for 15 years. The risk is worth it. The SEALs nodded. They understood risk. They lived in its shadow. For the next hour, Vance walked them through every detail. Satellite imagery, thermal scans, guard rotation patterns, building layouts, explosive entry points, and a dozen contingency plans for scenarios ranging from unexpected civilians to catastrophic equipment failure. She spoke with the precision of a surgeon and the strategic vision of a chess master. Every question was answered, every concern addressed. By the time she finished, the team knew the mission as well as they knew their own weapons. As the SEALs filed out to begin their final preparations, the commander lingered. "Kay," he said quietly, using her first name now that they were alone, "this one feels different, bigger." Vance gathered her materials, her expression unreadable. "It is bigger, Marcus, but you've handled bigger before." "Not with stakes like this." He studied her face. "How long have you been tracking Alpha?" 18 months, 3 false leads, 2 blown operations, and more sleepless nights than I care to count. She looked up at him. "This is our shot, maybe our only shot." Marcus nodded slowly. "Then we won't waste it." He started toward the door, then stopped. "That Marine captain upstairs, DeWitt, what happened to him?" Vance allowed herself the smallest smile. "Admiral Reeves is explaining the concept of need to know. I suspect he's learning a valuable lesson about assumptions." "About underestimating people, you mean?" "About underestimating women," Vance corrected. "It's a lesson some people need to learn more than once." Marcus grinned. "Well, he picked the wrong woman to underestimate. Valkyrie doesn't make mistakes." "Valkyrie makes plenty of mistakes," Vance said quietly. "She just doesn't let them kill anyone." After he left, Vance remained in the operations center alone. The screens around her displayed a dozen different feeds: satellite imagery, weather patterns, intelligence reports, and real-time tracking of assets positioning across 3 countries. She'd spent 18 months building this operation, coordinating with intelligence agencies, military commands, and foreign governments. Hundreds of hours analyzing patterns, following leads, and waiting for the perfect moment. And now, in less than 12 hours, 16 men would risk their lives based on her plan, her intelligence, her judgment. The weight of it should have been crushing. Instead, it felt familiar, like a jacket worn so long it had molded to her shoulders. This was her job. This was what she did. Not flying jets or commanding troops, but orchestrating the invisible operations that kept enemies awake at night and allowed Americans to sleep soundly. She was the shadow behind the headlines, the mind behind the missions that would never be declassified, and she was very, very good at it. Her phone buzzed, a text from Admiral Reeves. "DeWitt has been reassigned. He won't be a problem. Carry on." Vance allowed herself a moment of satisfaction before returning to work. There were still 1,000 details to confirm, 1,000 ways this could go wrong. She pulled up the mission timeline and began her final review, her eyes moving across the data with practiced efficiency. Somewhere above her, Captain DeWitt was probably packing his desk, his ego bruised and his career trajectory altered. She didn't waste time feeling sorry for him. In her world, assumptions got people killed. Better he learned that lesson in a briefing room than in a combat zone. The hours passed in focused concentration. Vance coordinated with the carrier strike group, confirmed weather windows, reviewed satellite passes, and ran through contingency scenarios until her eyes burned. At 2200 hours, she received confirmation that the SEAL team was aboard their transport aircraft, beginning their flight to the insertion point. At 2330, the FA-18s launched from the carrier. At midnight, the AC-130 took off from a classified airbase in the region. The machine she'd built over 18 months was now in motion, each piece moving with precision toward a single moment in time. All she could do now was watch and wait, ready to adapt if anything went wrong. She poured herself coffee from a pot that had been brewing for 6 hours and tasted like battery acid. It was perfect. At 0200 hours, her phone rang. The SEAL commander's voice came through, calm and professional. Valkyrie, we're 30 minutes from jump. Weather is holding. All systems green. Copy that, Marcus. Good hunting. See you on the other side. The line went dead. Vance set down her phone and turned to the main display, where a digital map showed the aircraft's position as a small icon moving across the screen. In 30 minutes, those 16 men would leap into darkness above a hostile country, trusting their lives to training, equipment, and her plan. The enormity of that trust never diminished, no matter how many operations she planned. Each one carried the same weight, the same responsibility. She thought briefly of DeWitt, of his confidence and dismissive attitude. He'd spent his career in cockpits, commanding squadrons and leading combat missions. Impressive, certainly. But he'd never understood that the most critical battles weren't fought in the air. They were fought in rooms like this by people like her who moved pieces across a global chessboard while the world slept. He'd called her sweetheart and assumed she was just another junior officer pushing paperwork. He'd been wrong. Catastrophically wrong, and now he knew it. But that was a small satisfaction compared to what mattered. What mattered was the mission. What mattered was bringing those 16 men home. What mattered was stopping Alpha and dismantling a network that had caused immeasurable suffering. Personal vindication was just noise. The mission was everything. At 0230, a new voice came through her headset. Valkyrie, this is Saber 1. We have jump clearance. Going dark in 3 minutes. Copy, Saber 1. Godspeed. The icon on her screen blinked once, twice, then went dark as the aircraft's transponder shut down. They were committed now, invisible to radar and satellite, free-falling through mountain darkness toward a target that didn't know they existed. For the next 90 minutes, Vance would have no direct communication with the team. They would be ghosts in the night, operating with complete autonomy. All she could do was monitor peripheral assets and pray her planning was solid. The coffee had gone cold. She drank it anyway, her eyes fixed on the screens, watching for any indication of complications. The weather held. The air support remained in position. The extraction helicopters began their approach to the staging area. Every piece was where it needed to be. But in special operations, perfection was a fantasy. Something always went wrong. The question was whether you'd planned for it. At 0315, radio silence broke. Valkyrie, Saber 1, we are on target, beginning approach. Relief flooded through her, quickly suppressed. They were on the ground, but the dangerous part was just beginning. Copy, Saber 1, execute at your discretion. 22 minutes. That's how long they had before the guard shift changed. 22 minutes to cross a mile of hostile terrain, breach a fortified compound, locate and capture or eliminate the target, and reach the extraction point. It sounded impossible, but these men had done impossible things before. Vance pulled up the thermal satellite feed, watching ghostly shapes move across her screen. She could identify the compound C heat signatures of guards in the towers, but the SEAL team was invisible, moving through shadows with practiced silence. She'd seen this before, watched teams execute missions with such precision it seemed choreographed. But it never got easier. Every second felt like an hour. Every minute was an eternity. At 0328, explosions lit up the satellite feed. Multiple breaches, coordinated perfectly. The operation had gone kinetic. Now it was a race against time. Vance's heart rate increased, though her expression remained calm. Her hands moved across the keyboard, pulling up additional feeds, monitoring radio frequencies, ready to mobilize assets if needed. The FA-18s adjusted their position, moving closer but still outside engagement range. The AC-130 crew went on high alert. The extraction helicopters spun up their rotors. Then silence. 3 minutes of absolute radio silence while the world held its breath. When the transmission finally came, Marcus's voice was strained but controlled. Valkyrie, Saber 1. We have Alpha. I repeat, we have Alpha. Request immediate extraction. Copy Saber 1. Birds are inbound. ETA 7 minutes. Understood. We're moving to primary LZ now. Vance allowed herself a single moment of triumph before focusing on the next challenge. 7 minutes was an eternity in a hot extraction. Anything could happen. She watched the thermal feed as the team moved away from the compound, their discipline evident even in retreat. Behind them, confusion erupted as guards realized what had happened. But by then, the SEALs were ghosts again, vanishing into the darkness with their prize. At 0342, the helicopters touched down at the primary LZ. At 0344, they lifted off with the team aboard. At 0356, they crossed back into friendly airspace. At 0430, they landed on the USS Abraham Lincoln's deck. Mission complete. 0 casualties. High-value target in custody. The operation that had consumed 18 months of Vance's life was over in less than 2 hours of execution. She slumped in her chair, letting exhaustion wash over her now that it was safe to feel it. Around her, the operations center began to stir as other personnel arrived for morning shifts. They saw a tired woman in a flight suit staring at computer screens, just another officer finishing a long night. They didn't know what had happened. They would never know. That was the point. Her phone rang again. Admiral Reeves. Valkyrie, preliminary reports indicate total success. Well done. Thank you, ma'am. The SEAL team executed perfectly. They had a perfect plan to execute. Credit where it's due, Commander. A pause. Get some rest. We'll debrief at 1400 hours. Yes, ma'am. Vance ended the call and stood, her body protesting the hours of stillness. She gathered her materials, secured the classified documents, and logged out of the systems. As she walked toward the door, one of the night shift analysts looked up. Ma'am, can I ask what operation you were running? Vance paused. No, she said simply. Then with a slight smile, but it was a good night. She left the operations center and walked through the empty corridors of Naval Air Station Oshina. Dawn was breaking, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. She thought about the 16 men now safely aboard a carrier, probably drinking coffee and reliving the mission with the mixture of relief and adrenaline that followed successful operations. She thought about Alpha, a man who'd orchestrated attacks across 3 continents, now in custody and facing justice. She thought about the networks that would crumble without his leadership, the lives that would be saved. And she thought about Captain DeWitt, who'd learned an expensive lesson about respect and assumptions. Her car was where she'd left it, in a far corner of the parking lot. She drove to her apartment off base, a modest place that contained few personal items. She was rarely there, preferring to spend her time at work where she felt useful. The apartment was just a place to sleep and store clothes. Home was an abstract concept for people like her, those who lived in the shadows and measured success in operations completed and threats neutralized. She showered, changed into civilian clothes, and tried to sleep. But her mind refused to quiet, still processing the mission, analyzing what worked and what could be improved. This was the curse of perfectionists. Success was never enough. There was always another operation, another threat, another target. The work never ended. The moment she stopped, someone else picked up where she'd left off, and the machine continued without pause. Eventually, exhaustion won. She slept for 4 hours, dreamless and deep, the sleep of someone who'd carried immense weight and finally set it down. When she woke, her phone showed messages from colleagues congratulating her on an unspecified success. News traveled fast in the special operations community, even when the news itself was classified. She responded with brief thanks, then prepared for the debrief with Admiral Reeves. The debrief was thorough and professional. They reviewed every aspect of the operation, identifying successes and areas for improvement. The Admiral praised the planning, the execution, and the intelligence work that had made it possible. When it was over, Reeves looked at Vance with something approaching pride. "Commander, I've been doing this for 30 years. I've seen hundreds of operations, worked with the best minds in the military. You're exceptional, truly exceptional." She paused. "Have you given any thought to your next assignment? I could use someone like you at Special Warfare Command." Vance considered the offer. "I appreciate that, ma'am, but I think I'm most effective where I am in the weeds planning operations." Reeves nodded. "I understand. Just know the offer stands. When you're ready to move up, there's a place for you." She stood, indicating the meeting was over. "One more thing. Captain DeWitt has been reassigned to a desk at Quantico. He'll spend the next year reviewing procurement contracts. I believe he'll have time to reflect on his behavior." "That seems appropriate, ma'am." "I thought so," Reeves smiled. "Dismissed, Commander." Vance left the Admiral's office and walked back through the base, her mind already moving to the next challenge. There were always more threats, more targets, more operations in development. The luxury of dwelling on success was one she couldn't afford. But as she walked past the briefing room where DeWitt had confronted her, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Not because he'd been punished, that was just a consequence of his actions, but because the mission had succeeded. Because 16 men had come home safely. Because a dangerous individual was no longer a threat. That was what mattered. That was everything. In the months that followed, word of Operation Tidebreak spread through certain circles. Not the details, those remained classified, but the fact of its success. Vance's reputation grew, though she never sought recognition. Officers who worked with her spoke in respectful tones. SEALs requested her specifically for mission planning. Intelligence analysts competed for positions on her team. She became a legend without trying, a ghost who orchestrated victories from the shadows. And Captain DeWitt, he spent his year at Quantico reviewing endless procurement documents, his career trajectory permanently altered. The story of his confrontation with Valkyrie became whispered legend, a cautionary tale about underestimating people based on rank or appearance. Some said he'd learned his lesson. Others doubted he was capable of learning. Vance didn't care either way. She'd moved on to the next mission, the next threat, the next opportunity to protect people who would never know her name. Because that was her calling. Not glory or recognition, but silent service in the shadows where the real work happened. Where assumptions could be deadly and respect was earned through competence, not demanded through rank. Where a quiet woman in a worn flight suit could orchestrate operations that changed the world, one classified mission at a time. And somewhere in a secure facility that officially didn't exist, 16 Navy SEALs raised glasses to Valkyrie, the woman who'd brought them home. They didn't need to know her full story to respect her. They'd seen her work. They'd trusted her with their lives, and she'd proven worthy of that trust. That was her legacy. Not headlines or medals, but the quiet knowledge that she'd made a difference. That lives were saved because of her work. That threats were neutralized before they could cause harm. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't celebrated, but it was essential. And for Kay Vance, that was more than enough.